Welcome, welcome, welcome. Revelation is a revolution. This is session 14. And we're going to look at some of the coincidences between the revelation and Josephus' writing of the history of that time, that is, between 66 and 73 AD, the time that Revelation explains in a spiritual sense, and Josephus tells us about from first eyewitness discovery. So I know that I'm on here. You can see my face most of the time, but if we ever finish this series, which I expect we will the next couple of weeks, you'll have a nice textbook because I'll gather my notes all up here, which is a significant number of notes, and put them all in a book or a folder, and then you can download them if you ever want to try to teach this yourself or know more about it or try to remember what we've talked about before. You'll have a great textbook you can download and study the notes. And while we're at it, let me put into the chat the website that we're collecting these notes and chapters of the new translation of Revelation. There it is. It's jihadblogs.org/revelation. That's how easy it is. jihadblogs.org/revelation. About everything we talked about there, including quite a few of the illustrations and the translation as well. We're up to finish the 20th chapter. So now we've got two more chapters and we have completely translated the book from the Greek, from the scratch. And I'm looking at my translation. It's very literal. I think it is really good. It's modernized. I know a lot of translations of scripture say it's modernized, but they're really not. We modernize this so that it would be more like we might be reading it in the 21st century instead of from the first century or from Elizabethan English, which I do not like. Now, you ever wonder why Israel, or really we should say, as the Romans called it, Palestina, as small as it is, has been one of the most fought over territories since the beginning of civilization? And it has. And I had up here for a little while a map. I'll put it back on here and I'll tell you why. You never know it. Here's the Middle East and part of Europe. And you can see somebody scribbled on here, Via Maris. Via Maris, which means the way, the via or the road, Maris is of the sea, the way of the sea. And this was an actual highway in the time of the Roman Empire. Here's Rome, but you could see it goes up and down coasts wherever a person could walk or ride a carriage. And here is Palestina, where it says Israel. Goes around through what was called Carthage, on up and back to Rome again. Take a look here. If somebody wanted to do trade and they didn't want to do it by trying to go through Cape Horn there at the bottom of Africa, well, they would do it from the roadway and they would do it on the Via Maris. And from here to Africa, going down to Africa, this is the only place you could really get through. Deserts, bandits, This was all pretty well populated here in Anatolia, now called Turkey. But this stretch here was the only way to get through on the Via Maris without being robbed or murdered. So when the caravans came through, yeah, there were plenty of lesti, plenty of bandits waiting for you everywhere you went, but you didn't dare go out here because of the desert area there. Now, if you wanted to go to China or Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan, then this was especially good because from here in Palestina went the Silk Road. There we go. Silk Road came up this way and toward China, which was safe. And if you wanted to go down to Africa with your trade, well, of course you wouldn't want to go out here. The only way you could really go is go to Cairo and then south, wherever you wanted. Also, to lower Africa, oftentimes you take a ship from the Red Sea and go on down this way and go to Mombasa, which was a big trading center, even in the first century. So that's why this little piece of land is so important from time immemorial for trading. It was the only way through to the east, only way through to the west, only way to Africa. And not only that, but one other place that was very big for trade, of course, is India. So that is why that little piece of land is so important and why so many different powers tried to get it on account of world trade. Via Maris and the Silk Road. Let's not forget that. Last time we were doing some case studies in Revelation that we look at the text and then we look at Josephus' accounts and we find all kinds of contradictions. And we've got three more to go through. Case study number 6 is Revelation 16, 3 through 6, which I'll read. And this is from the New Translation. If you have a Bible and you want to, turn to your traditionally translated Bible to Revelation 16, 3 to 6. I'm not going to give you much time. You're just going to have to stop the recording and check out the difference in the translation. Okay, verse 3. And the second messenger, hold on a second. Yeah, okay, sorry. And the second messenger poured out its bowl into the sea, and it became blood as of the dead. And every being in the sea died. The third messenger poured its bowl into the rivers and the water springs, and they became blood, or as blood. And I heard the messenger of the water say, right are you, the one being and the one having been. Oh, set apart one, because you've judged these things, because they've poured out the blood of the Kadoshim, that is the holy people, and of the prophets, and you've given them blood to drink as they deserve. And I heard the altar saying, this is the altar up in the sky, yea, sovereign, almighty Elohim, true and right are your judgments. So as a description of the second and third bowl judgments, Josephus describes how in the spring of 68 AD, Vespasian prepared for the eventual siege on Jerusalem by marching against Gadara, the metropolis of Perea. Now, Gadara It's part of the Decapolis. If you've ever looked at your Bible maps, this is where they had pigs. This was considered a Gentile area. And it was where the Gadarach demoniacs were, the two demoniacs in that particular story. And the rest of Perea as well, where Vespasian was taking comfort for a little while. That's in Jewish Wars, Book 7. Perea was the region just east of the Jordan River, just next to Judea and to Jerusalem. So you go over the Jordan and you're in Perea, and the Romans, if you were an Israelite, supposedly couldn't touch you over there. Some of the Jews who fled from Gadara joined with others and got, quote, in great numbers together and fled to Jericho. That's in War 4.7. And Placidus, who was Vespasian's assistant, chased them. Placidus drove the whole multitude to the riverside along the Jordan River. Then things really took a tragic turn. And this next quote is from Josephus to tell about that turn. Then they extended themselves a very great way along the banks of the river, speaking of Placidus and his troops, his legion, and sustained the darts that were thrown at them, as well as the attacks of the horsemen, who beat many of them and pushed them into the current, at which fight, hand to hand, 15,000 were slain. So we've got the Romans there beating up on the zealots and whoever else was there, while the number of those that were unwillingly forced to leap into the Jordan was prodigious. So just plain old people around there, and they had to get into the water because they were forced in. And Jordan could not be passed over by reason of the dead bodies that were in it, but because the lake Asphaltus or Asphalterus and was also full of dead bodies, that's the Dead Sea, that were carried down into it by the river. And now Placidus put his soldiers on board the ships and slew such as had fled to the lake, unquote. So this lake Asphalterus, the Dead Sea, John saw a sea that became blood as of a dead man in Revelation 16:3. And he saw that, quote, every living creature in the sea died. Josephus said that the Dead Sea was full of dead bodies, and that Placidus killed everyone else who fled to the Dead Sea. That's very coincidental. John saw rivers and springs of water then turn to blood, and that those who shed the blood of saints and prophets were given blood to drink. Josephus said that a multitude of Jews was pushed into and unwillingly forced to leap into the current of the Jordan River. And that river was so full of dead bodies that no one could pass over it. Some of them drank the bloody water as they drowned. Of course, when it says that the water became blood and different kinds of exaggerations like that, we should probably think of the water was as blood. Josephus says it was actually red water. Lots and lots of dead there in Josephus' account, 15,000 at least, and in the biblical account as well. So many dead that you couldn't cross the Jordan. Amazing. So that's another case study, number 6, and we go on to number 7. We're just going to hop over to Revelation 16 and verse 19. Where it says, and the great city was split into 3 factions. Now, we're talking about Jerusalem here. How many times have people said to me, ha ha, well, this can't be a real talk about the War of Jerusalem because Jerusalem didn't break into three factions. Well, we shall see. And the cities of the foreigners fell. And Babylon the Great was remembered before the Elohim, who was to give the woman, that is the whore, the cup of wine of the fury of his wrath. Now, this is from John's description of the seventh bowl. The great city, as we've seen in previous sessions, was Jerusalem. So the downfall of the nation of Galilee in 67 AD can be seen mostly in the War of the Jews, Book 3. Galilee was first to be conquered before they ever went to Judea. And needless to say, as you probably know, every town and city in Galilee was conquered, and those that stood up to fight against the Romans with their walls and their war machines, they all lost. Notable exceptions were Gamla in the north, or Gamala. Some people look at it that way, but not Kamala, just Gamala, which was situated on a cliff. And the Romans finally got up the mountain to Gamala and got into the city despite the walls and went through the city, and the people of the city were smashed toward the cliff, and the only thing they could do was choose whether to be killed by the sword or jump off the cliff. And they did, in the droves, in the thousands, in Gamla, jump off the cliff. That was the most fortified city that Israel had in the Galilee. And another one, Yotapata, was a fortified city with very strong double walls. And there, Vespasian, he brought his troops, knowing that Josephus was in there. Josephus had been appointed to be the general and savior of Galilee. But unfortunately, the Galileans didn't like the idea of having a Jerusalem priest as their general, so they fought him every lick of the way. And in the time of the siege of Yotapata, Josephus was captured. He was captured, and there was the place where he was put in chains and was going to be taken back and executed during a triumph there in Rome. But he made a prophecy that I've mentioned several times. He prophesied to Vespasian himself that he was the king that was prophesied by Balaam. Remember the star prophecy? Why, sure you do. And that Vespasian would become the king of the world, or as he would say at the time, the emperor of the Roman Empire. And Vespasian said, we're just going to keep you and find out and see if you're a true prophet or not. But Josephus actually was a true prophet as well as a priest. He prophesied a number of things that did come to pass. Question is, was Josephus a believer? And I'm pretty sure that he was, at least by the time of his death in 96 AD or something, because we don't know what happened to him. We know that in 96, a number of very high-born people in the Roman Empire were executed, including the family of the emperor, for their propensity to pass on a foreign superstition. And that foreign superstition was Nazarene Judaism. Okay, so this great city. The downfall of Galilee then in 67 AD can be seen mostly in the War of the Jews, Josephus' book, book 3, as I mentioned, in the previous section, we saw that Vespasian subdued the entire nation of Perea in the spring of 68. Then, in the summer of 68, Vespasian was at Caesarea, or Caesarea, some call it, and he was, and I quote, to march directly to Jerusalem from there. And that was when he learned that Nero had died in June 68 AD. If Nero even died, we're not sure, but we are told not only in the histories, but also in the Revelation chapter 13 that Nero, the beast, had a head wound that he suffered and died, and then he came back to life. And the head wound was exactly the same as Nero had, having Epaphroditus, his secretary, help him to push the dagger in to Nero's head to kill him. Nero just kept coming back. 3 different Neros came back. So did he die or did he go on, or was Nero the beast resurrected? Well, that would be an incredible thing to read in the Revelation. And in some passages, yes, it could be interpreted that way, that the mortal wound was healed and Nero came back. But Vespasian then waited for a year in Alexandria and Caesarea in order to see until it was safe to go up and take up his empireship in Rome, for he was called to be the next emperor. And he was, of course, again, the general that took Galilee and the one that was ready and set up to go into Jerusalem and destroy that place and end up the war. But he took a little break then, and he said, why not take a break while they're all killing each other? While they're killing each other. In the meantime, then, another nation fell. This nation was Idumea, but it was at the hands of Shimon bar Giora, a Jewish zealot leader. He first laid waste the whole country of Idumea, attacking Hebron, ravaging cities and villages, and making Idumea like a desert, it says in Wars 4 and 9. And then he compelled a great number, and I quote, of the Idumeans to retire to Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. He followed them himself also to the city. Then Josephus said that he was, quote, a greater terror to the people than the Romans themselves. That is Simon, Shimon. But the zealots in Jerusalem were even more heavy upon the people than Simon and the Romans were. Yes, the zealots were in power in Jerusalem at this time, but they weren't the only power there. There are actually 3 powers there, and each of the 3 powers was led by a bandit, led by a psychopath. So it was amazing because Simon was probably the worst of the bunch. Simon by himself with his little army cleared out and destroyed the entire country of Idumea. Idumea is south of Benjamin, that is south of Jerusalem, down in the desert areas there of the Sinai. So these people in Jerusalem thought Simon would come in and he would keep the Romans out. So the people, and I quote, made joyful acclamation to him as their savior and their preserver, thinking he would save them from the madness of the zealots. However, Simon bar Giora looked upon them all as his enemies. In April then of 69 AD, Simon got possession of Jerusalem. They opened the gates to him and his army, thinking he was going to be their Messiah. Soon the stage would be set for Jerusalem to be divided into three factions. But first, we'll take note of more cities that fell during this time, just as Revelation said that they were falling. For in May to June 69 AD, Vespasian marched against those places of Judea which were not yet overthrown. Quoting again Josephus, he only spared the Herodium, Masada, Machaerus, and Jerusalem, which all of these were controlled by the Zealots. They were Herod's built fortified places up in the mountains, primarily, Herodium, Masada, Machaerus. So they were not easy to get to, and neither would they be able to conquer. So Vespasian just left them alone, and he went after the lowlands there and paused his campaign a little bit then when he learned that Vitellius, another general, had become interim emperor of Rome. That was the year of the 4 emperors. Vitellius was a drunken fool, yet he had, through his parents' prominence, become a general of legions in Germania and Gaul. So he brought his troops, his legions, south down to Rome, and he was able easily to rout the previous fake emperor there, whose name was Otho, and become emperor for a day. Vespasian's son, Titus, was dispatched then to besiege Jerusalem, which we read about that in Jewish Wars 4 and 5. Now, during this time, there's a pretty simple table of the nations that fell. Just in 2 years, 67 AD to mid 69 AD, these are nations. There were uncountable towns, villages, and cities that fell, but these are nations. So one we can count as Galilee, which fell in 67 AD, conquered by Vespasian and Titus. And Perea, then to the east of the Jordan River, it fell in the spring of 68 AD by Vespasian. Idumea, as we just mentioned, late 68 to 69 AD. The person who conquered Idumea was Simon Bar Giora, a Jewish zealot, as we mentioned. And Judea, most of it, with the exception of a few strongholds, like I mentioned before, and Jerusalem, fell in May to June of 69, and Vespasian, of course, was the general that took care of that. Then in Jerusalem, it's divided into 3 parts. In Wars 5, at the very first chapter, Josephus describes the conditions in Jerusalem in December 69, and here are his words. The sedition at Jerusalem was revived and parted into 3 factions. We knew that because Revelation says that the city was split into 3. We think that it was because an earthquake split it, but that's not. It's written to deceive. Let's put it that way. It's all a riddle. So there are 3 factions in there, and each one of those factions fought against the other. There was civil war within Jerusalem. One should not mistake if he called it a sedition begotten by another sedition, and to be like a wild beast grown mad, which for want of food from abroad fell now upon eating its own flesh. Exactly. Jerusalem, not only the three sections fighting against each other, but they had burned the food supplies, so there was no food in there either, and thousands of people died of starvation. And we'll continue with Josephus. And now there were three treacherous factions in the city. The one parted from the other. Eleazar ben Simon and his party that kept the sacred firstfruits came against Yochanan, that is John Levi of Giscala. Josephus' great enemy was the head of a second faction. And those that were with John plundered the populace and went out with zeal against Simon Bar Giora. So the whole place is in chaos, one sedition upon the other. How would the zealots ever be able to conquer the Romans when they're conquering each other? And Vespasian is just laying off. He says, let them kill each other. Let them kill each other. The more troops will preserve that way. It's a very clear fulfillment of John's words that the great city, in this case meaning Jerusalem, was divided into three parts, as it says in Revelation 16:19. So don't tell me because you misunderstood what the Revelator says that it never happened. It's also a flashback to Jerusalem's earlier destruction in 586 BC. This is important. In Ezekiel 5, we see that Ezekiel was required to shave his head and divide it into three parts, the hair that is, and Elohim told him, this is Jerusalem. In Ezekiel 5, verse 5, 1/3 of his hair was burned, 1/3 was chopped up by the sword, and the last third was scattered into the wind. Wow. That leads us into our next case study, number 8, Revelation 16 and 21. This is too similar to call it a mere coincidence. Too similar. So in verse 21 of chapter 16, it says, and a huge hailstone weighing about a talent, it's about 100 pounds, came down out of the sky upon the people. Yet the people reviled the Elohim on account of the plague of the hail. For great is its plague, exceedingly so. Now look, this plague of hail was not water hail or ice hail. This plague of hail was the plague of all these many stones, a talent or smaller, being shot in to Jerusalem and other walled cities by the engines of war of the Romans, because those rocks and stones were falling like hail. There were so many of them, exceedingly so. A great plague of hail of rocks. This is also from John's description of the seventh bowl. Compare this again to the following description of stones catapulted over the wall of Jerusalem by the 10th Roman Legion in May of 70 AD. This reading is found in Wars 5.6. The engines that all the legions had ready prepared for them were admirably contrived. But still more extraordinary ones belonged to the 10th Legion, Fulminata. Now the stones that were cast were of the weight of a talent and were carried 2 furlongs and further. It escapes me what a furlong is, but you can imagine a 100-pound stone being cast in the air into Jerusalem over the walls, how far that would go and how powerful it would be. Continuing, the blow they gave was no way to be sustained not only by those that stood first in the way, in the road, in other words, but by those that were beyond them for a great space. As for the Jews, they at first watched the coming of the stone, for it was of a white color, and could therefore not only be perceived by the great noise it made, but could be seen also before it came by its brightness. Accordingly, the watchman that sat upon the towers gave them notice when the engine was let go, that is, when the stone was shot, and the stone came from it, and cried out aloud in their own country language, saying, "The stone cometh." In other words, they were speaking Latin and calling out, "The stone cometh." Or maybe those inside were speaking Aramaic or Greek, "The stone cometh." So that there were in its way, those that were in its way stood off, and they threw themselves down upon the ground, by which means, and by their thus guarding themselves, the stone fell down and did them no harm. But the Romans contrived how to prevent that by blacking the stone, painted it black, and then could aim at them with success when the stone was not discerned beforehand, as it had been until then. And so they destroyed many of them with one blow. John saw hailstones weighing a talent falling from the sky over Jerusalem. And Josephus describes white stones weighing a talent being catapulted into the city. What a coincidence. They're both talking about a talent. They're both talking about a stone 75 to 100 pounds. Now, here is a very interesting passage from the translation of Josephus of William Whiston's, and that translation goes back to the 1700s, I believe. That's a popular translation because it's inexpensive, and Josephus' War is still selling in books like crazy. You can get one on Amazon, a used one. I just got a great big, large print used one for about $5. And it's a big book. So from his Whiston's famous translation of the works of Josephus, the watchman shouted this, "The sun cometh." That is, the S-O-N cometh, when these stones would be shot in, rather than the stone cometh. J. Stuart Russell, in his 1878 book, The Parousia, that is the presence, speaking of the second presence of Yahshua, he pointed out that it was only 8 years before this, in 62 AD, that as James the Just, Yahshua's brother, was being martyred, that he cried out that the Son of Man was about to come in the clouds of the sky. James was taken up to the parapet of the temple, and he was commanded by the priests that he should set the people straight about Yahshua, that Yahshua was not a Messiah, but instead James went up there with them and said, "Can't you see the Son of Man coming in the clouds?" and pointed up to the clouds. So Russell speculated that the watchman gave this cry in mockery of the Christian hope of the parousia, or the second presence. So here we're finding a very possible connection between the death of James, thrown off that parapet of the temple, and what was going on here in Jerusalem just less than 10 years later. James was killed in 62 AD. And in one place, Josephus tells us that it was his death that lit the war, that caused the war in the first place, because James was so popular. And so we did that in a different session, talked about James. So Russell speculated that that cry, the sun cometh, was in mockery of what James the Just had said from the parapet of the temple. The Son is coming, the Son of Man, speaking of the Son of Man. So these great big stones were actually discovered in an archaeological dig during the last couple years. There are articles on this that you can read. And there's photos of the stones, white stones blackened. So you can take a look at that on the internet if you want. And that ends case study number 8. We've got one more. The earlier case studies are on last week's session. Excuse me. Case study 9 is from Revelation 17, 12 through 16. And I quote from the Snyder version, "And the 10 horns you saw are 10 sovereigns who haven't yet received sovereignty." Hold on just a second, please. "But they receive authority as sovereigns with the beast for 1 hour, a short time." So we've got these kings that haven't received their kingdoms yet. And when they do, they're with the beast and they have that kingdom for only a short time. These have one reason to exist: to give their power and authority to the beast. Again, this is Revelation 17. "These will war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will beat them, because he is master of masters and sovereign of sovereigns, and the ones with him are called and elect and trusting." And he tells me, "The waters you saw, where the whore is seated, are people and crowds and cultures and languages." And yes, the symbolic meaning of seas or lakes or storms, if they're used symbolically, they mean people and trouble with people, or the stirring up of calamities with people. "And the 10 horns that you saw, also the beast, these will despise the whore, and they'll denude and make waste of her, and they'll eat her flesh and burn her in fire." So, as I mentioned before, until a few months ago, I believed, well, let me see, maybe I won't, let me not add this, but I still believe that the beast in Revelation was Nero. That's the face of the sea beast of Revelation 13. And I haven't got, oh, have I? Yes, I have. We talked about earlier how to prove that Nero is the beast, or the Therion, the wild man. Therion is the actual word that we translate as beast. And one exegete that I have been studying thinks that those 10 horns may have been 10 senatorial provinces of Rome. And I think it was the provinces of Rome. 10 is not needing to be an exact number. It's just an about number, but it just so happens that there were 10 of those. And these 10 senatorial provinces were working with Nero to persecute the Christians in the Neronic persecution, known in the Revelation as the Great Tribulation, and to help Nero, the beast, capture and burn Jerusalem in 70 AD. And of course, all those provinces sent their armies in to help Vespasian and Titus to destroy Jerusalem. Armies came from everywhere. These weren't just Romans coming in. In fact, most of those legions were not Romans at all. When some are thinking now that when Titus overthrew Jerusalem in 70 AD, he didn't have any leaders or representatives of those 10 provinces with him. Well, honestly, we don't know whether he did or not. He didn't even have 10 legions with him. Instead, he had 4 legions. Still a lot of people. The 5th, 10th, 12th, and 15th Legion, according to Wars, Book 5:1. However, as I mentioned, the legions were made up of all kinds of nationalities from all over the world, including Africa. And we're not informed about many of the lesser rulers in attendance at the siege. We only know the names of a couple of those lesser people. But Josephus lists exactly 10 high priests and religious leaders in Israel who were given authority as generals in December of 66 AD, right after the Neronic persecution began. 3 of them were even killed by the Zealots in early 68 AD, fulfilling Daniel 7, 8, 20, and 24. And here's a quick summary of what led up to the selection of these 10 generals. Josephus says that the Jewish-Roman War officially began in August 66 AD when Eleazar, the son of Ananias, the high priest, who, quote, was at that time governor of the temple, persuaded those that officiated in the divine service to receive no gift or no sacrifice for any foreigner. This is what they did. They would bring gifts in on behalf of Nero or behalf of foreigners or behalf of Gentiles, and they would sacrifice these animals for these leaders on the outside so that Elohim would bless them in what they were doing. Yes, including Nero, including the Roman Empire, emperors and leaders. They sacrificed in the temple so that they would have good luck. And one of the things that the priesthood and the Romans had in common, besides wanting to alleviate the war, is to get rid of the Nazarenes, get rid of the Judeo-Christians. So these guys also massacred a Roman garrison stationed there at the Antonia fortress on the east side of Jerusalem. So in November 66 AD, Castius Gallus, that's when he brought the 12th Legion to put down the Jewish rebellion. Surprisingly, though, as I've said several times, his army suffered 5,700 deaths. His weapons and supplies were stolen during an ambush. The Romans retreated on November 22nd, and the Jewish rebels chased and killed many in an ambush over the next 5 days. The Jewish temple leaders knew that a full-scale Roman revenge was inevitable. I mean, the Zealots destroyed the entire army of General Castius Gallus. That was the first battle when Castius was able to get into Jerusalem, and his orders were to go in there and destroy and capture it. But for some reason, nobody knows today, he just left. He left Jerusalem and started marching his troops back up to Caesarea. And on the way up to Caesarea, not far from Armageddon, the troops were picked off wholesale. Almost 6,000 of those legionnaires were picked off. And remember, one legion is about 6,000 people. So the Jewish temple leaders knew that a full-scale Roman revenge was inevitable. Something was going to happen for them to come back, and certainly it did. For they got together in great numbers in the temple, and they appointed a great many generals for the war. And here's a list of the territories they were to oversee in preparation for war with Rome. One was Yosef, the son of Gorion, who was the governor of Jerusalem. Ananus, the high priest, the father of Ananias that we mentioned just a minute ago, he was the governor of Jerusalem. Jesus, or Yeshua, the son of Sophias, one of the high priests. He was an Idumean. Eleazar, the son of Ananias, the high priest, Idumean. Niger, or Nigar means black, of course, the then governor of Idumea. Yosef, the son of Shimon, who was the leader of Jericho. Manasseh of Perea. John the Essene, who was the toparch of Thamna. Lydda was also added to his portion. Lydda was also added to his portion, and Joppa and Emmaus. John, the son of Matthias, that was a priest. He was of the toparchies of Gophnikia, and Acrobatine. How about that? Josephus, the son of Matthias, you already know who he was. He was called a general and sent out. He was sent out over the Galilee, and Gamla, which I mentioned was the strongest city in those parts, clear up north. He was put under his command. 3 generals that were killed by the zealots in fulfillment of Daniel 7, 8, 20, and 24 is Ananus ben Ananus. That was the priest that ordered the death of James the Just. They knifed him to death, daggered him to death, took him and threw him over the Jerusalem wall on the outside. Niger of Perea was also killed, and Yosef ben Gorion. 3. Their deaths were recorded in War 4 and 5. How did these horns make war with the Lamb? In a nutshell, Yeshua, Jesus, made war against the harlot, the great city of Jerusalem. Yes, he did. Being with his forces, the 144,000 on top of Mount Zion, while all the fighting was going on, and being seen in the sky fighting with his army against the armies up there that were fueling the Romans and the Zealots. Jesus made war against the great city, Jerusalem, and he used the Roman army as his instrument. If you don't think so, take a look at Matthew 22, verse 7. The Zealots and those who aligned themselves with them fought desperately to maintain power over Jerusalem and to gain the independence of Israel. How did they turn on the harlot, make her desolate, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire? They were assigned to Idumea, Jericho, Perea, Galilee, Jerusalem, etc. During the Roman-Jewish war, Jerusalem became more and more isolated as Rome captured Galilee, Perea, and other places. Many people made their way to Jerusalem, and presumably these generals did the same, made their way to Jerusalem. Of course, Josephus was captured there at Jotapata. So we already saw the quote from War 5:1, where Josephus described the sedition in Jerusalem and the civil war between the zealot factions as, and I quote again, a wild beast, therion, the exact same word used for the beast, therion, a wild beast grown mad, which for want of food from abroad fell now upon eating its own flesh. Yes, there was famine in Rome because the grain supplies from Egypt had been cut off. So there's a kind of a simile here between eating one's own flesh, being a cannibal, and not getting your corn dole. Josephus also repeatedly blamed the Jews, especially the zealots, as did Yeshua, for the fire that burned Jerusalem and were occasioned by them. In War 6:6, he records a speech given by Titus, that is Josephus, in which he said to the zealots, and I quote, "You have set fire to your holy house with your own hands." Josephus made similar statements several other places as well. So, based on these case studies, all 9, and I know that that's an awful hard bunch to remember, but if you come and get session 14 notes and you really want to learn this, then you can learn it because everything I'm telling you here, I have noted in very easy to read form. But I would like to suggest that the seals, trumpets, and bowls were structured this way, that the seals happened from 66 AD to 70, maybe earlier, the seals being opened. The trumpets from 67 AD to early 68, which was the siege of the zealots, and the bowls from spring 68 to 70 AD. To use an arm as an analogy, the seals would stretch from the shoulders to the fingers. The trumpets would stretch from the shoulder to the elbow. The elbow would represent the zealot siege of 68 AD, and the bowls would stretch from the elbow to the fingers. This represents an ongoing study. There are many, many more parallels between the book of Revelation and Josephus, not included in this study. They're everywhere. They're everywhere, including words out of the 2 manuscripts that are exactly the same or describing the same thing, or Josephus giving us an explanation in physical words we can understand for some things that Revelation presents in spiritualized ways. So you can evaluate these case studies and come to your own conclusion when you download these notes and go out there yourself and see what you can find more. You'll find a lot. Now, for the rest of the time, I was going to go on to chapter 17 and 18. I'll tell you what, I'm a little bit out of voice by this time. And so let's just leave it at that. And we'll go back to talk about the whore and mystery Babylon and the rest in 17 and 18 as the war is starting to break down and the revelation is starting to get to the very point of the whole book. So thank you, my friend, for listening, and I hope to see you again soon.